Hey there, welcome to Factually. I'm Adam Conover. Thank you so much for joining me on the show again. This week on the show, because of some events in the news, we're talking about vaccines. So I just want to start by, making one thing very clear at the top of the show. We're going to say this as bluntly as possible. Vaccines are one of the great scientific triumphs in all of human history. In the last 50 years, vaccines have saved an astounding 154 million lives, and 100 million of those lives were infants, literal babies. 100 million baby lives saved in 50 years. Now, you would think that this would be thought of in our society as a big win. Oh, we saved 100 million baby lives. Good job, us. But unfortunately, as you well know, increasingly, that is not the case. A lot of Americans have decided that vaccines are bad. I guess they like dead babies. I don't know. A movement that has existed on the fringes for many years has finally become mainstream. COVID has given us perhaps the greatest vaccine success story ever. We literally learned how to harness the very programming of our own cells to give our bodies resistance to a virus it had never encountered before, saving, again, untold millions of lives. But the environment of mistrust and misinformation surrounding these vaccines and vaccines generally inculcated a serious doubt about them in the minds of many Americans. Today, nearly 17% of parents say that they have delayed or skipped a vaccine for a child, nearly 1 in 5. And that number rises to 26% for Republican parents. And these numbers keep going up. And it gets worse because as I'm recording this, an anti-vax charlatan named Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is in the process of being confirmed by Congress to be put in charge of our entire public health apparatus. The man is not a doctor. The man is, in fact, an insane person with a worm in his brain, and he's about to run the entire healthcare system for the entire United States. Things are going off the rails in America. So, you know what? This seems like a good time to step back and ask, hey, why exactly are vaccines so important? What was life like before them? And what world do we risk entering back into if we leave them behind? Today on the show, we are going to give you the blunt truth about vaccines from a scientist who knows, and we are going to arm you with the vaccine yourself against misinformation so that you know the truth and you can spread it in your community where it can do some good. But before we get to that conversation, I want to remind you that if you want to support this show and all of the incredible conversations we bring you every single week, please support us on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Adam Conover. $5 a month gets you every episode of this show ad-free. We got a lot of wonderful community features as well. And if you want to come see me do some stand-up comedy, you want to have a little lightness in your evening, you're a little worried about the state of the world and you just want to laugh and have a good time, come see me on the road. On February 21st, I'm going to be in Chicago at Talia Hall. On February 23rd, I'll be in Boston at the Wilbur, 2 wonderful historic theaters I cannot wait to perform in. March 6th through 8th, I'll be in Burlington, Vermont at the Vermont Comedy Club. March 22nd, I'll be in London at the Leicester Square Theater. March 26th, Amsterdam at Boom, Chicago. After that, I'm going to Providence, Rhode Island, Vancouver, Canada, Eugene, Oregon, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. Head to adamconover.net for all those tickets and tour dates. I would love to see you out there. And now let's get to this week's episode. To give us the honest truth about vaccines straight from the horse's mouth, we have someone who knows better than almost anyone else on the planet. His name is Dr. Adam Ratner, and he's NYU's head of pediatric infectious diseases and the author of the new book, Booster Shots, The Urgent Lessons of Measles and the Uncertain Future of Children's Health. Please welcome Adam Ratner. Dr. Ratner, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
So we're talking about vaccines today. There is a lot of misinformation and skepticism about vaccines that has only grown in recent years. So let's start out by just telling me a little bit about yourself and the credentials by which you speak on this.
Sure. So my name is Adam Ratner. I am a pediatric infectious diseases physician, meaning I did training first in general pediatrics and then in infectious diseases. My current position is as the head of pediatric infectious diseases at both NYU Hassenfeld Children's Hospital and at Bellevue Hospital Center. I'm speaking today not as a representative of either of those places. I'm here speaking as an author. I'm the author of a book that's about to come out called Booster Shots, The Urgent Lessons of Measles and the Uncertain Future of Children's Health.
So let's jump into it. How much have vaccines altered life for humanity? First of all, if we can take the big picture view.
Vaccines are arguably one of humanity's greatest accomplishments. In terms of lives saved, they are up there with clean water and sanitation. It is, our lifespans are much, much longer than they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And that is in large part due to vaccines.
Give us an example. Do you have any numbers of how many lives have been saved, if that's even possible to quantify?
Sure. So thinking about the measles vaccine first, the measles is the most contagious disease known to man. Millions of cases a year, still hundreds of thousands of deaths a year from it. There's an estimate of somewhere around 60 million lives saved just in the past 20 to 25 years with measles vaccine.
Wow.
And going back further than that, it's, the effect is even greater.
And why are vaccines especially important for children?
So the things that we vaccinate people against in this country and in much of the world tend to be the infections that cause death or severe illness in young children. And it used to be that a large percentage of children died in the first 5 years of life. It's still much too large a percentage. It's still somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 in 17, 1 in 18 children die before age 5. But it used to be something more like 1 in 4. And there was probably a time when it was more like 1 in 2. And a lot of that early death is due to infection. And so we have been able to, with vaccines, provide protection against a subset of those infections, not all of them. I wish we had vaccines against all of them, but it has been miraculous that we've been able to prevent some of these things that used to cause death commonly.
Yeah, there was sort of a presumption 200 years ago that if you had kids, a bunch of them were going to die. You would have a whole bunch, and it's like a numbers game. Well, I had 10 kids because I knew 5 to 7 of them were going to die. Now I got 3 left. So I at least got a couple heirs. But now we have the opposite presumption that our children won't die. It's considered to be unusual. I mean, of course, it's a tragedy either way, but it's now much more of an unusual thing to have happen.
Right. Absolutely. I think that there was much less certainty 100 years ago that if you had a child, that child was going to grow up to be an adult. And I think we have that now, and horrible things do happen, but they happen rarely. And a big piece of that is vaccination.
So tell me a little bit about, the moment that vaccinations like this became common and routine. It's not that long ago, right? We're talking in the last 150 years, right? Like what was the effect on, the American population, on the sort of national psyche? Tell us the before and after.
Yeah, so I think that, if you think back to the 1800s and what the causes of death were in children, there were deaths from infections right around the time of childbirth, and we have strategies to prevent some of those now. We had a lot of children who died in early childhood from smallpox, which we now never see because it's been eradicated thanks to vaccines.
It's been eradicated worldwide, right?
Yes. So I'll draw a distinction because I'm sure we'll talk about this later. There's eradication and there's elimination. And so eradication is wiping something off the planet. And that is, so you do not have to think about it again. You don't have to vaccinate against it anymore. And so we did that with smallpox, and we've only done that with one other disease. And it's not even a disease of humans. It's a disease of livestock called rinderpest. And we managed to eliminate rinderpest as well.
And can I ask, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just
no,
want to make sure I've always wondered this. I remember reading as a kid about the eradication of smallpox, and smallpox is like extremely communicable disease, killed tons of people. Measles, as you said, also very, similarly, or I don't know how contagious it is, but, very, very contagious, very, very deadly. Yet it has not been eradicated. What is special about smallpox, or conversely, what is different about measles?
Right. So some of it is when vaccines came around for these things. So the smallpox vaccine was really the first vaccine, and there was slow uptake at first, and there were anti-vaxxers back then as well. There were people who thought that smallpox vaccine was interfering with God's will. There were people who thought that because the smallpox vaccine originated from a virus that was in cows, that there are cartoons from back when it came out of people turning into cows after getting smallpox vaccine. But
would you rather be a cow or have smallpox? That's my question. I think I might prefer to be a cow. It's a nice life.
It's hard to know. Yeah. So I think that over time, it became clear that the people who were getting vaccinated were not getting smallpox, and people started vaccinating their kids. And then there was this, it's incredible to think about now, given everything that's going on in the world, but there was this incredible international cooperative effort. Every country participated in this, where we vaccinated essentially the entire world. And, there were people looking for cases in the last few countries. And then if there were cases found, they vaccinated that person, and then they vaccinated everyone around them. It was a strategy called ring vaccination. And finally, in the 1970s, eradication was certified, and so it's not that long ago, right? I mean, there was still smallpox in the world in the late 1960s.
Wow!
And if a generation before me, everyone was vaccinated against smallpox. I was born right on the cusp, and so I did not get a smallpox vaccine because eradication had
we don't even vaccinate it against it anymore because it has been eradicated.
Right. The vaccine did its job so well, it put itself out of a job.
Wow.
And that's what vaccines do. That's the curse and the blessing of vaccines, right? So when they work, nothing happens. People don't get sick. Like it just looks like regular life.
Yeah.
But the thing about that is then people forget how important it is to keep vaccinating, because everything other than smallpox that's a human disease is still around. Even though we may have a vaccine against it, we may never or very rarely see it in this country. Measles, polio, like all sorts of things that the generation before us thought about all the time, we now don't see. They're still there. There are still countries with polio. There are still places with lots of measles. So it's and that's the distinction between eradication and local elimination. Local elimination is amazing. It's a great accomplishment, but eradication is forever.
Yes. And so how did this change life, and what was the public reception of these vaccines? I mean, for smallpox and polio, by the way, being a disease that you would contract and then it would disable you, right, for the rest of your life if you caught it as a kid. That was a very, very terrifying disease, like to have floating around, right? And then for it to be eliminated or eradicated in this country, like how did that change life for people?
It's hard to even describe what a big change that was. And I think that's why in the mid-1950s, there was this enormous randomized controlled trial of the Salk polio vaccine, the first polio vaccine. Mm-hmm. And there were these kids called polio pioneers who got either the vaccine, and we didn't know how well it would work, or a placebo. And they saw an enormous difference in rate of polio between those two groups, where the vaccine protected kids against getting polio. And when those results came out in 1955, it was like a national holiday. Like people were celebrating this. It was all over the newspapers. People could not wait to get this vaccine for their kids because they had been terrified of polio. And if you read, newspapers or books from back then, people talk about living in fear of polio because it would strike, kids who were healthy, who were active. You look at, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who developed polio, was a young man when he did, but he was an active, athletic guy, and it disabled him permanently.
Yeah. And the disablement, I mean, everyone has that image of FDR in their head, but it could also be a lot more intense and disabling than that even, right? Can you just
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a spectrum of what polio disease looks like, just like there's a spectrum of most diseases. And some people who came into contact with poliovirus and got polio infection had a minor flu-like illness and then got better. And then some people had paralysis that lasted but then got somewhat better over time, but still maintained a deficit. Some people were permanently disabled. Some people ended up in, you see the pictures of iron lungs from the 40s and the 50s where because their respiratory muscles were affected, they had to be in these, giant cylinders to help them breathe.
That where the cylinder is like, your lung muscles have atrophied or have been paralyzed, and so the cylinder is breathing for you by changing the air pressure that your body is, and you basically have to live in that. I literally just saw I think it's that one of the last people to live permanently in an iron lung recently passed away. That this is like within living memory. We only have one or two people left who were affected by polio in that way, where they're still living like that. But that's how recent it was.
Right. And I know people, I have friends and colleagues who are people who had polio as children and still have, some deficit from it. And it was a frightening disease. And it's, I think when the chance came along to prevent that, people jumped at it.
Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine, it's the mid 20th century must have been an amazing time to live, because there are all of these incredible life-changing advancements that are happening and are just good. Not like our technological advancements today where we're like, I got the iPhone. Now I'm addicted to the thing. And fuck, it looks like it is contributing to the downfall of all forms of media and institutions and our democracy, perhaps. And oh boy, this is a little bit concerning, as amazing as it was. Geez, now a billionaire is in charge of it and he's fucking with me, etc. Back then it was like, somebody invented a vaccine. It's going to save millions of lives. Like, there are all of these incredible advancements that are transforming life for the better. And vaccines were like one of the, the main achievements of science in that time period.
Yeah. And I think, I think of vaccines as close to just an unalloyed good as you can get. And that's not to say that they're perfect. There's no such thing. And there are, as the anti-vax people will happily point out over and over, there are some minor risks to vaccination. There was an incident early in the poliovirus vaccine rollout called the Cutter incident, where instead of one company making all of the polio vaccine, the technology was given to multiple companies, and they started making it. And basically, the way you make the Salk polio vaccine is you grow up a whole bunch of polio virus, you kill it with formaldehyde, you process it, and that is your vaccine. And one of the companies had a quality control issue in a plant, and some of the polio virus was not killed and caused paralysis in some of the kids who received the vaccine. That was horrible. It was also discovered quickly. Those lots were recalled. The quality control was put in, and the polio vaccine that we use today and that we used subsequently doesn't have that issue. So it's, there's unbalance. I think that the polio vaccine did tremendous good, continues to do tremendous good today. But I think that vaccine safety is something to pay attention to, and it is something that, contrary to what many of the anti-vaxxers say, it is something that people like me and my colleagues think about a lot. We think about balancing risks and benefits.
All right, guys, let's be real for a minute. Nobody's got time for stiff, uncomfortable clothes anymore. Know what I mean? It's February, it's March, it's cold outside, and you deserve to be comfortable in whatever you're wearing, no matter what you're doing. And that is where Public Rec comes in. These pants are a game changer. They're designed to be as comfy as your favorite sweats, but way more stylish. We're talking super soft fabric, no stiff seams, and enough stretch to keep up with whatever your day throws at you. Public Rec isn't just about pants. They have so many great style options, whether you're working all day in the office, running errands, or just grabbing a drink with your buddies. Who doesn't want to look sharp without sacrificing comfort? And let me tell you, once you put these babies on, you are going to wonder why you ever wore anything else. Public Rec not only has the most comfortable pants ever made, but they also have a huge selection of high-quality, everyday premium styles. You can even revamp your entire wardrobe with their perfect-fitting polos, shorts, and hoodies. So this February, treat yourself right because comfort is always in season. Upgrade to Public Rec and feel the difference. For a limited time, you can get 20% off at Public Rec by using code Factually at checkout. Just head to publicrec.com, use code Factually, and you're all set. Oh, and when they ask how you found them, be sure to mention our show. It really helps you out. And I have tried these pants myself, and I love them. Find your perfect fit and never compromise on comfort again. Public Rec, where comfort rules. This episode is brought to you by Squarespace. You know, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Life happens online, and that is why it is crucial to put your best foot forward, whether you're running a business, growing a brand, or just sharing what you love. And that is where Squarespace comes in. With Squarespace, building a stunning website is effortless. You can showcase your work, connect with your audience, and sell anything, products, content, even your time, all in one place and completely on your terms. Squarespace lets you seamlessly integrate your social media posts and your clips right onto your site so your audience can find everything in one spot. Selling products? No problem. You can sync your catalog with Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Google in just a few clicks. And of course, Squarespace makes it incredibly easy to sell, whether it's physical products, memberships, exclusive blog content, videos, or tutorials. Whatever you're offering, they've got you covered. If you're ready to take your company or personal brand to the next level, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/factually to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. I also think about before we had vaccines, we would practice inoculation. Is that the correct term for, and I know earlier in like the 18th or 19th century, was more like someone will come to your town and like smear some cowpox into an open wound or something like that. And that was semi-effective, but was a lot more dangerous, right? Like there were more dangerous forms of fighting these diseases before the vaccines.
Right. They would do it with real smallpox. So the idea was they would take, material from the scars of people who had smallpox, little bit of it, scratch it into a wound, or, one of the earliest ways that it was done was they would squirt it up the nose, like make a powder out of it and put it up the nose. And the idea was that people would get a mild case of smallpox that would give them immunity. And it worked sometimes. The problem with it was the real virus and it had the potential to give someone actual smallpox.
Yeah.
Which is why when the idea of using a virus that gave you immunity to smallpox without the risks of smallpox came around, that was a much more appealing thing.
I remember this scene from a little bit of a tangent for the John Adams miniseries on HBO. I don't know if you ever watched this. It's like over 10 years ago. But what's amazing about this with Paul Giamatti's in it, what's amazing about it is they spend a lot of time on how horrible medicine was then. Like there's a lot of stuff, George Washington had like very painful dentures. There's a lot of him like having a lot of difficulty talking because of his bad dental work. And there's like an inoculation scene where I believe one of John Adams' relatives is like, is inoculated and there's an adverse result. And it just really makes you dwell on, not a lot of films show you how disgusting the past was medically. They want to sort of make things look nice and pretty. This one is really invested in going like, no, they wore wigs because their hair was terrible and they all smelled bad and they were all sick all the time and there were no cures. And it really, one of the side effects makes you very grateful to be alive in this time period after the creation of vaccines and all these other medical innovations that we've had.
Absolutely. I think that, the first attempts at vaccines were crude, and they worked, but they had substantial risks that went with them. And we're in a very different place now where there's a lot of quality control and a lot of safety monitoring.
So I can't really imagine a greater medical advancement than, eradicating smallpox and eliminating measles and polio in this country. Those three diseases combined millions and millions and millions of lives over the past century, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So now, though, in recent years, we've started to see measles come back in this country because people have not been vaccinated. And of course, we've seen the rise and now the virtual enthronement of the anti-vaccine movement in the person of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who, as we're speaking now, just finished being grilled by the senators, looks likely to be appointed. He may be appointed to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services by the time that this is by the time this airs. So how did that rise look from your perspective as a doctor, right? Because you've been practicing for the entire rise of this movement, right? Why has it happened, and what does it look like from your view medically?
Yeah, it's complicated. It's discouraging, especially the last piece of what you talked about, which is where we seem to be heading now in this country and worldwide. I came into medicine at an interesting time. Like some of the vaccines that we talked about, polio vaccine, for example, had been there for many years. By the time I came into medicine, I didn't take care of children with polio when I was a resident because there was a vaccine against that. I didn't even take care of kids with there's a disease called HIV, which used to be one of the top causes of early life sepsis, of invasive bacterial disease in children. It killed many, many children in the U.S. every year. It causes bloodstream infections. It causes meningitis, and a vaccine against that came out in the mid 1980s and was in widespread use by the early 90s. And so by the time I was doing my training, Hib disease had basically disappeared. And I would talk to pediatricians who were 10 years older than me, 15 years older than me, who used to spend an enormous amount of time thinking about Hib, taking care of children with Hib, and then it was gone. And
wow,
during the time that I trained in the early part, we had invasive pneumococcal disease. Again, a bacterial infection, horrible in children, still something we see occasionally, but we spent a ton of time on that, a ton of effort. I've seen children die of invasive pneumococcal disease more times than anyone could ever possibly want to. And that's not completely gone, but much, much, much less common than it was a couple of decades ago because a vaccine against that came out. And so I got to see the effect of vaccines essentially in real time. And, I think the thing that really brought it home to me in terms of what we have the potential to lose is I went through a lot of my training never seeing measles and then seeing, a couple of cases in returning travelers when I was an infectious disease fellow. And then in 2018 and 2019 in New York City, we had this huge outbreak of measles. There were 600 and something cases in New York City itself, another couple hundred up in Rockland County, which is just north of the city. And this was all in a community that had essentially stopped vaccinating because they were targeted by the anti-vaccine movement. This was a very clear, culturally targeted attempt by the anti-vaccine.
In what way were they targeted? And yeah.
So to be clear, I'm talking about Orthodox Jewish communities that live in sort of a cloistered community in Brooklyn.
Got it.
This is a group of folks who tend not to get their information from the internet, to get it in lower tech ways. And there were specific pamphlets printed up in Yiddish and in English. They were distributed at supermarkets. There were hotlines set up for new mothers to talk about coping with being a new mother, and they would have anti-vax speakers on these things. This was a very directed attack on this community.
Who was doing this?
So a lot of the early messages came from Andrew Wakefield and others who were who were prominent in that world. They were filtered through some of the other people who were prominent in the anti-vaccine movement, and then it was done with cooperation of some people in the community. And there are pretty good histories of this that have been written, and I talk about it in detail in the book. But it's interesting because the overall vaccination rate among kindergartners in New York City at the time of this huge outbreak was about 98%, which is well over the 95% that you need to stop an outbreak. So it was confusing to me that we were seeing all of these kids coming into the emergency room with measles, but it turned out that the vaccination rate in these specific communities in Brooklyn was about 50 or 60%.
Right.
And so you can have spread in these cloistered communities, and the disease occurs in the unvaccinated. It occurs rarely in people who maybe have gotten one dose of measles vaccine instead of two, which is the recommendation. But it's almost exclusively in the kids who are unvaccinated, and mostly in kids who are unvaccinated because their parents opted out.
Wow. And so you're seeing this movement, the anti-vax movement, target a specific community, right? They get infected by the anti-vax sentiment, right? By the propaganda, by someone from outside converts someone inside the community to the anti-vax way, and then they start propagandizing the community. The vaccination rate plummets. And then almost immediately, there's a major outbreak of measles that's sending kids to the emergency room. And that made national news, by the way. And so what I'm wondering is, why is that not the end of it? Right? If there's the very clear evidence that everyone can see in front of their faces, hey, this single community ceased vaccinating on a wide scale, and then a bunch of their kids went to the hospital. I assume some of their lives were threatened. Were there any deaths as a result?
So fortunately, there were no deaths.
Okay.
There were children in intensive care units, but we were very lucky that both in Rockland and in New York City, there were no pediatric deaths during that. There was a measles death in 2019 that was in an adult that was outside of those communities. But there's only so much you can plan on getting lucky. And the death rate from measles in the US is probably on the order of 1 per 1,000 cases. It depends a little bit on the age structure. It depends a little bit on who's getting infected, but so it's not crazy that you would have an outbreak that had 700 cases or something like that and not see a death. But there's only so much you can mess around.
But so why does this not cause, in any of the folks promoting this misinformation, a reevaluation of, okay, a whole community did what we said, and then there was a measles outbreak? Right.
Yeah. Right. I know. So, I mean, I think there are two pieces of it. We saw this with the Disneyland outbreak, to go to your side of the country for a sec, in 2015, where there were all of these cases among unvaccinated folks in California and who had traveled to Disneyland. There was the initial response to this was, from the anti-vaxxers was, there are only 20 cases, there are only 30 cases, now there are only 100 cases. And there was a pretty strong pro-vaccine response at that time. If you look at what was in the LA Times back then and what was being written nationally, people were like, this is a problem. The anti-vaccine movement is a problem. I think there's less of that when there's targeting of very specific communities. We see this with the Somali community in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, where there have been measles outbreaks, again, because the anti-vaxxers, including Andrew Wakefield himself, went and visited that community multiple times, because it was a community that they thought was susceptible to this, to those kinds of ideas.
I did not realize that Wakefield, by the way, is the disgraced doctor from the UK who promoted the original idea that vaccines cause autism, which has been disproved time and time again. Is there anything else you'd like to say about Wakefield specifically?
There's a lot, but it's a family show.
Okay. Well, I was aware of him. I was not aware that he and people like him were specifically targeting what you would have to call vulnerable communities, right? Communities that have a limited amount of access to outside information, or where something like this can spread really widely. That's repulsive.
Yeah, agreed. I think that they're opportunists.
Yeah.
And that is, and I think part of the issue also is if you talk to some of the people who have really bought into the anti-vaccine messages, you talk to people in Brooklyn who believe this, they'll say, yeah, there were 700 cases, nobody died, no big deal. But it is a big deal. And it's a big deal for a few reasons. The first is that if you continue to do this, someone is going to die. The second is that measles is weird. Like, measles is the most contagious disease we know. And it also, if you have measles, it makes you more vulnerable to other infections for several years afterwards. So we've seen this in multiple studies. And so it puts those kids at higher risk of dying from other infections for a couple of years after measles. And then the third thing is, yeah, if it starts in a community that makes this decision, that's one thing. The problem is the only reason that it stayed in that community in New York City or within the Somali community in Minnesota is that we have this sort of wall of immunity around it where the rest of the population is vaccinated. But if you look at what has happened to childhood vaccination rates since 2019, since the pandemic and since all of the, very active outreach by the anti-vax folks, we used to have, about 95% of kids in the US vaccinated against measles. So overall, it's now under 93%. That's kindergartners. And that's less than we need. And the trend is bad. Like, it's less this year than it was the year before. We have fewer states with sufficient levels of measles vaccination now than we did last year, and fewer than the year before that. The trend is bad.
So what explains that? I mean, at this time in 2019 that you're talking about, I remember this moment. And at the time, the anti-vaccine movement was kind of seen like almost like the flat earth movement, this obviously incorrect, movement of very deranged people, right? People who really are either behaving very cynically or, have really something wrong with their reasoning. And it's like a virulent, way of thinking, but it's small, it's a niche, right? And it's causing individual problems in localized areas. That's how I treated it, as that form of conspiracy theory. Now in 2025, it's absolutely mainstream, and we're starting to see these levels dropping. And again, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is like about to, or currently is, the head of our, he's one of the people promoting these ideas and now is running our nation's healthcare system. So we can't just explain it as, hey, there's a small number of people who are spreading, malicious misinformation. Something bigger is going on. What has changed over that time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious big thing that was between 2019 and where we're sitting now is the COVID pandemic.
Oh, of course, the COVID
Remember
pandemic.
That? Yeah,
there you go. I completely forgot about the COVID pandemic.
Did you miss that?
I've kind of memory hold it for myself, and so now that you bring it up, yes. How did that affect the anti-vaccine movement? Because it was a very clear before and after of that movement.
Yeah, no doubt. And even during. And I think if you look at what the anti-vaccine movement was saying, even at the very beginning of COVID, before there were vaccines available, they were saying, this is our moment. This is our chance. People are thinking about infection. People are thinking about vaccines, and, getting out there, sowing doubt. If you RFK was speaking out against the COVID vaccines before the COVID vaccines were available, before we knew whether there was going to be a COVID vaccine available. And then once there were vaccines available, almost immediately he was saying, oh, they're more dangerous than the disease. They're, he advising people not to take them, saying that, COVID either doesn't affect kids or was good for kids, like lunacy. And I think that got mixed up in people's other feelings about the pandemic, some justified and some not. I think people were terrified during the pandemic. I certainly was. Went to work every day, took care of kids with COVID, took care of kids with things that weren't COVID. And I think that people were frustrated about the messaging, about masks, about schools, about all sorts of other things. And, my personal opinion on that is that the public health people that were at work during COVID were heroes and were doing the best that they could in terms of providing guidance. It is very difficult to know what to do with a disease that you've never seen before,
Yeah.
where you're not even sure at the beginning how it transmits. And you just want, and people are dying and you just want people to be safe. It's not to say that public health was perfect during COVID. And I think we all learned a lot, but I think there is this carryover mistrust from that. And it bleeds into how people feel about routine vaccines. And some of that is expected, but I think that some of it also is very deliberate messaging by the anti-vaccine movement.
Well, look, there was a resistance to all of the public health measures during COVID-19. And to a certain extent, it's very understandable because there's, at a moment like that, public health means getting the entire public to do or not do certain things, either asking them to or making them do it, saying, hey, you cannot go to school, you must wear a mask to enter the space, etc. And if you are talking about the entire population, there's going to be some part of the population that says, fuck you, don't tell me what to do, because that's human nature. And this is America. And this is a country where part of the culture of America, for better or for worse, is we don't like to be told what to do. So some of that response is understandable. But what I feel like really got missed, I'd love to dwell on for a second, I've talked about on this show before, the incredible scientific and health advancement that was the COVID-19 vaccines. Like, we did episodes about this. The fact that we were able to develop a vaccine for a disease that we had never even seen before within months by understanding our own bodies. We basically reprogrammed our own immune systems to fight a disease that had never encountered before via, the mRNA molecule, excuse me. Just tell me a little bit about that from your point of view, because this looked to me on par with the development of the polio vaccine.
It was like magic. It was, I don't know that I'd ever been prouder of us writ large than during that moment.
Wow.
I felt this incredible sense of relief when I got my first dose. I cried when my daughter got her first dose because I was so happy. I was so scared about her. My wife is also a physician. She was working during it. I was overjoyed when she got her first dose. It's, it's hard to remember what the time felt like and how short the time was between the discovery of this virus and having a vaccine against it. And, you have people out there yelling, the vaccine kills more people than the virus, which is insane. And saying that people shouldn't take it. The COVID vaccine has saved tens of millions of people's lives, potentially mine and yours. And I am grateful. I am grateful to the people who worked on it. I'm grateful for the people who worked on the mRNA technology for the 30 years before that, when they had trouble getting funding to do it.
It's literally like, my understanding is our ability to create a vaccine like that just came into being like literally a year or two before COVID-19. Like the technology was completed at almost the exact same moment that the disease arose, in like a really fortuitous stroke of luck.
Yeah, I mean, it's a stroke. It was like a stroke of luck, like 3 decades in the making, though.
Yeah,
like
of course.
It was fundamental science that was supported by NIH, which we were talking about Kennedy and the new administration. Like, this is what the NIH gets you. Like what we give to the NIH goes to fundamental discovery, and in the absence of that, we wouldn't have had the COVID vaccine. We would have had millions more deaths, probably in the US, certainly worldwide. And it makes an enormous difference. And we're lucky that, that the timing of the mRNA technology maturing and the COVID pandemic were close to each other, where we were able to use that technology to protect us.
And my understanding is, the real advancement is that as opposed to taking like some sort of dead sample of the disease and turning that into a vaccine, it's literally we are coding what our body needs to know in order to create an immune response without giving people a dose of the original disease itself. So it's actually safer and more advanced than a more traditional vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the amazing things about it is that you don't even need a sample of the virus to do it. You just need the information, like the genetic code. So when the genetic makeup of the virus was shared from the early cases in China and elsewhere, they had the groups here had the information that they needed to start making the vaccine. And that's part of the head start that got us the vaccine as early as we did.
Folks, this week's sponsor is one of my personal favorites. I endorse them wholeheartedly, and I've been using this product for real since long before this podcast even existed. They're called Delete Me. You know, you may not want to hear this, but it has got to be said. Our data is out there. There is a whole thriving ecosystem of data brokers, people who collect, buy, and sell our personal information. That means your name, your phone number, your home address, the names of your relatives and your friends can all be out there waiting to be snapped up by anyone with an internet connection. You know, I've talked before about how exposed I felt when I realized people were literally buying my home phone number, my cell phone number from these data brokers. I could tell because I suddenly started getting crank calls from mysterious people I had never heard from before. And frankly, I would not wish that feeling on anyone. It felt like an invasion of privacy. It was after that incident that I signed up for Delete Me, and I have not regretted it even for an instant. In fact, I signed up my entire family because I want them to have the same level of protection that I do. Since I've done so, those calls have stopped, and we have all felt a lot safer. And that is really important because nationwide, harassment and online bullying are on the rise. You know, it seems like every single week I hear a story about a real-life incident that began as an argument or interaction between two strangers on the internet, but turned into some kind of stalking that happened. You know, you deserve to feel secure and anonymous on the internet and not have to be constantly anxious about scammers finding your phone number, phishing attempts being sent to your email, or strangers knowing how to find your front doorstep. So for your safety, I suggest you check out Delete Me, not just for you, but for your friends and family too. You can get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/Adam and use promo code Adam at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/Adam, promo code Adam. Folks, this episode is brought to you by Alma. Isn't it wild how the things we turn to for comfort often end up making us feel worse? I mean, I've definitely caught myself doom scrolling or getting stuck in endless social media loops that just leave me feeling more disconnected from the world around me. In a time when we are all stretched so thin between our physical and digital lives, building real, meaningful human connections has never been more important. And that is why, if you're seeking some help in dark times, I recommend looking at Alma. They make it easy to connect with an experienced therapist, a real person who can listen, understand, and support you through whatever challenges you're facing. I can tell you firsthand how much finding my therapist who understands me really helped me on my journey of mental health, and you can find the perfect therapist for you too. With Alma, you can browse their online directory and filter by what matters to you most. And then you can book a free 15-minute consultation with therapists that you're interested in. Unlike other online therapy platforms that just match you with whoever's available, Alma lets you choose someone you truly connect with because the right fit makes all the difference. With their help, you can start seeing real improvements in your mental health. Better with people, better with Alma. So visit helloalma.com/factually to get started and schedule a free consultation today. That's helloalma.com/factually. Do you think that there was some sort of failure of telling the story of this vaccine? Because again, Jonas Salk, national hero, right? Worldwide hero. I know the guy, most people know the guy's name, even if they don't know what he did because he was so famous. But was the story not told well enough? I mean, I think about the number of podcasts that have, dudes interviewing astrophysicists and, computer scientists about AI going like, wow, that's so cool. Whoa, wow. Technology is amazing. Science is amazing. Why weren't those same people telling the story of how incredible this vaccine is? Instead, they were spreading misinformation about it. They were saying, I don't know if I want to put that in my body, instead of lauding the scientists, which is what they do on the rest of their fucking episodes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's some of it, I think, came from people's individual experiences, where you could envision that if someone was at work one day and then was told they had to stay home, stay in their bubble, have their kids in their bubble with them, and didn't really see people getting sick, or only saw the people around them who, maybe got sick and then got better from the virus. Even if they saw what was on TV, they didn't experience it in the same way.
Right.
I think polio was more of a shared experience, because even if you didn't know someone with polio, you had the issue where kids weren't going in the swimming pools in the summer because there had been a case of polio in the next town over or something like that. And so I think that people felt that more acutely. And it's not that people didn't feel COVID. Of course, people felt COVID, but people felt it in their homes, having to work from home, having to watch their kids while their kids were doing Zoom school. And I think it made people angry.
Yeah.
Obviously. And who could blame them? And so I think it was wrapped up in that. And we just have more access to fringe beliefs now. And if you have people saying this is a miracle, the vaccine is wonderful, but you also have all of these loud voices being like, this is completely bogus, and you don't know who to trust.
Yeah.
It's hard.
And I think literally being made to stay inside broke people's brains, because people were isolated, and suddenly they have nothing but the internet. Right. And, social distancing as the initial approach to to COVID-19, I think absolutely saved lives. I think what we maybe did not anticipate was how that was going to change our culture and our information diets and our politics in ways that were really negative, and we're still feeling. I kind of wonder if the historians of the future might say, hey, public health wise, this made a lot of sense. But if you look at how social distancing affected the worldwide culture and how it reverberated, maybe the bad outweighs the good. I'm not saying we shouldn't have done it because it was the best information we had at the time, but like the amount of reverberation socially from that choice, so massive. And because it ends up supercharging an anti-vaccine movement that is going to result in deaths now, right?
Yeah, well, counterpoint.
Please.
There were literally refrigerated morgue trucks outside of hospitals in New York City because we didn't have room for the bodies in the hospitals.
Yes.
So it was an emergency.
Yes.
And so do we need to calibrate where the emergency ends and where you open things up? Sure. But we didn't know the end of the story at that point in the story. And we didn't have a vaccine at that point in the story. So it's very hard. Like you see yourself as a point, you see what's going on as a point on the curve, right? But you don't know if the curve is on the way up or about to peak or.
Yes. And
so it was okay that people had to stay indoors. It was okay that we closed schools. It was good that we closed schools. I'm a pediatrician. I want what's best for kids. Kids belong in school, but at the time, it was an emergency.
Yes. And I don't say that to second guess. I'm not one of those people who's like, learning loss. They shouldn't have closed the schools. They shouldn't have kept people home. It was clearly the best decision to make at the time. But I think that we are still discovering how it broke our culture in ways that are also having material effects on our health. And I think that's something that we have to acknowledge. And if you are, I make a distinction on this show a lot between medical technology or scientific technology and social technology, our understanding of how the decisions that we make affect our society, and that's important to take into account in public health. And I guess the way I'll put it is, I think that the next time there's a pandemic emergency of this type, I think we'll have learned a lot about what these sort of public health measures, about other things that they do to our society and our culture that we are going to need to take into account next time. Okay, we need everyone to stay inside. We just need to remember 20% of the population is going to lose their fucking minds when we do that. And that is also a public health outcome that we need to be cognizant of.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah.
Completely agree. And, I think that part of the issue also was we had data from relatively early that you could get kids back in school and you could do it safely with masking and distancing and all the other things that made school uncomfortable. But we did have kids back in school and we did minimize spread in that way, but it took effort. And, something that I said a lot at the time, and I think a lot of us said at the time, was maybe the balance is that you have kids back in school, but you have fewer things open for, you don't open restaurants at full capacity yet. Like, you don't have to do everything all at once. You can prioritize the things where we think the public health outcomes with the behavioral outcomes are going to be the most impactful.
And as you say, there's plenty of things that we would do differently. That's one of them, were we to do it now. But we were doing the best we had with the information we had at the time. I certainly, believe that our public health system was, there was a lot of heroic work that people did, even though mistakes were made, as they all are in any group enterprise. So, but how did this change the anti-vaccine movement in ways that are affecting us now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we went from a situation where people, in the pre-pandemic period, I think most people had a lot of trust in public health and in doctors to do what was right. And most people defaulted to doing the regular immunization schedule because that was the regular schedule. And I think that the pandemic, in large part due to the fact that the anti-vaxxers pushed both their messages about the COVID vaccines along with their messages about routine vaccines, I think a lot of people now are saying, hey, wait, homeschool was really bad, and there are all these people saying that the COVID vaccine was really bad. How do I know that the regular schedule, how do I know that the polio vaccine is safe? I think it bled over, but I think it bled over on purpose.
What is the anti-vaccine movement's goal? You said they're opportunists. They took it as an opportunity to push it. I'm going to assume that many of them believe what they're saying, despite the fact that the evidence all contravenes it. But what is the self-interested reason to do so, other than simply being a proselytizer and gaining followers, which I'm sure feels good? I also enjoy just having people listen to me. That's why I do this. But I'm not like, how does one profit from misinformation like this?
So I think there are two things. I think there's are the leaders in that movement, and then there are the people who receive the messages and how they act on them. And I think for the second group, for the parents who are making decisions about what to do for their kids, these are people who love their kids. These aren't people who want harm to come to their kids. They're trying to make the best decision that they can for their kids in the face of some people saying you need to do this thing and some people saying this thing is very dangerous.
Yeah.
So I think there's not a dedicated self-interest there, even for parents who are really pushing the idea that vaccines are unsafe. I think you're right. I think it's because they truly believe that and they think that that's the right thing to say. And then there are the people kind of at the head of the movement, and we're talking about, RFK Jr. and Del Bigtree and all of these folks who profit tremendously from this. So Kennedy makes millions of dollars from children's health defense and from the anti-vax books that he writes and the books that cause people to make threats against Tony Fauci and Bill Gates. And there are movies and there are the onesies that Bernie Sanders was showing on the congressional hearings for RFK, the unvaxxed unafraid onesies that RFK's group sells. There's merchandise, there are followers, wow. There's advertising dollars, there are all of these things, and it is big money. And I think in large part for the leaders of the movement, it's a grift.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say that none of them believe what they're saying. I think that they do believe what they're saying. It happens to be wrong, but
the best grift is one that you believe profitable. In, right?
Probably.
And both things can be true. But I really want to dwell on that point that you're saying that many of the people who follow the movement have good interests at heart. I remember receiving an email, I think we had done a previous episode on anti-vaxxers, and I got an email from a parent who said, hold on a second, Adam, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I just think that my kid shouldn't get the hepatitis B vaccine, or is it B? Am I correct?
B.
My kid shouldn't get the hepatitis B vaccine because that's a disease that only affects heroin addicts and gay people. And I have a child, right? And I said to this person politely, well, but that is a piece of anti-vax propaganda that you have ingested. Actually, there's a very good reason for a child to receive a hepatitis B vaccine, which I hope you'll tell us. But this is someone who, had just been, heard some shit from other parents at the dog park, or, this information had gotten to this very well-meaning parent in a way that seemed very normal and natural. And to them was like, no, it's not anti-vax. It's just common sense. It's just, something normal that I'm reading on Facebook or Nextdoor, or again, I heard from a parent at a PTA meeting. And so that to me was the red flag of, this has really been mainstreamed. This propaganda that is being spread as a grift has entered the mainstream consciousness of parents in America. Well-meaning, smart, reasonable people have been infected with this stuff.
Completely agree. And just to talk about the hepatitis B vaccine for 1 second, because it's an important vaccine. It's a vaccine that we give to young children in part because hepatitis B virus is transmitted perinatally from moms or from other folks to children. And it can happen early in life, including right around the time of birth. That happens commonly. It happened commonly before there was a vaccine available. Not everyone with hepatitis B knows that they have hepatitis B. And so there can be spread that way. There's spread within households among children. And the mother who you described, the logic would make sense if her facts were correct, but they're not. It's not a disease of only, people who she considers morally deficient adults. It is a disease that is often acquired in childhood and causes liver cancer, causes chronic liver failure. It is a major cause of disease, and it's an like the HPV vaccine. It is an anti-cancer vaccine. It is one of a couple of vaccines that we have that prevent the development of a specific kind of cancer. That is freaking magic.
Yeah.
In a different way than the COVID vaccine is magic. But that's amazing. We should celebrate that, and we certainly should celebrate the HPV vaccine, which can prevent almost 100% of cervical cancer and a large percentage of penile cancers and throat cancers and all sorts of other stuff.
Imagine if we had a vaccine for breast cancer or any other.
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we have the chance to wipe out a form of cancer, we should probably take it. And giving it to everyone is an important step in reducing that, not just the bad people who you think get it more often, right?
Right. And I think that, some of this some of the issue is the erosion of, I want to say respect, but that's not exactly what I mean. Valuing of expertise.
Yeah.
So of people critically looking at the source of their information. And some of the problem also is that there are people with fancy degrees after their names who will say insane anti-vaccine things. There's the Surgeon General of Florida who has stated that the COVID vaccine doesn't work, that it kills people. And again, that's false, and he knows it's false. I don't know what his grift is, but that is that is shameful. But for most people, I think that you probably shouldn't value the medical opinion of the person at the PTA meeting more than you value the medical opinion of your pediatrician.
Yeah.
And that's why I do some work within the AAP and other organizations, because I think that the messages that come from pediatricians are generally still trusted, and that we need to use that as a way of communicating. But it's hard. It's hard in the face of this just relentless torrent of information, much of which is crap.
Is part of the problem that people are shopping for their experts, that, as you say, there is a critical mass of people with a couple letters after their name who are spreading the misinformation in a grift. And so you can go find, look, here I am in LA. I'm sure I could find plenty of MDs in LA who, if I was a vaccine skeptical parent, would give aid and comfort to that and say, no, you don't have to. No, those people are not for your very rich child. Your very rich child will never have hepatitis B, so don't worry about that. No, you're much smarter than the other parents. I'm actually the smartest doctor. I'm the doctor with the most expertise. That's a real phenomenon, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's a problem. And I think that there is a lot of people being outside their lane in terms of their training. And there's a lot of valuing of opinions of people like RFK with no medical training at all and no scientific training at all.
Has no medical. Yes, he has no medical training. He's
right.
Did you see the headline about how his application to Harvard, he just wrote his name on the application, his entire application to Harvard. He just wrote Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on a piece of paper and got into Harvard. And these are the people telling us that, like, oh, DEI is causing an erosion of standards when the man's entire career is just based on the fact that he was the son of a murdered brother of a president who was also murdered. The murders are very bad, but
of course,
can
we agree to be against murder? I think we're against murder.
We're against murder, but bizarre that this is seen as a piece of expertise when the man is literally only where he is because of a legacy. That's beside the point. Why do you think that as you said, in the days when polio was killing people and the vaccine came out, there were anti-vaxxers then, and it makes complete sense. Like, vaccination has a certain counter logic to it where, hold on a second, you're going to come tell me that I have to put something into my body that is you're telling me it's going to change my body forever in ways that you think are good. What if they're bad? It's completely reasonable that some portion of the population is going to say, huh, what? And that some smaller part of the population is going to say, fuck you, I don't want to do it. When you're talking about millions of people, that's going to be the case. Why is it now taking root and changing our public health in this large scale way, whereas it did not, 70 years ago?
Yeah. And to be clear, I'm not against people asking questions about vaccines or saying, are you sure this is safe? Or what is behind the fact that you're saying that this is safe? Of course, like I want to be asked those questions. And I want, the pediatricians in general are happy to talk to parents and explain why for those things. So it's not that that's a crazy question to ask. It's not. But I think that it's the combination of people's individual experiences with COVID and people's, exposure to these, bad information from all around. And I don't know, it is hard to be a pediatrician or to be someone, a public health person who is trying to put out a message. And sometimes the messages are nuanced and sometimes it's not as easy as saying something. One of the reasons I think that the vaccine autism thing will not go away is that it is so simple. It is, it's vaccines cause autism. It's easy to remember and it explains incorrectly, but it explains something that is mysterious. And if you go to your pediatrician and you say, what causes autism? A good pediatrician will say, well, autism is complicated. There are a lot of things that can cause it. Some of them are infections. Some of them are genetic. Some of them are probably environmental. And that's a less satisfying answer.
Yes.
But it's the right answer.
Yes.
And the problem is that if you have someone feeding you in a loud voice with a fancy website, someone feeding you a simple explanation for an important question about your kid, it's easy to get sucked into that.
Yes. I think that it's also the fact that right now we have what I think of as a mainstreamed counter-reality political movement where there's a number of issues where every scientist, or 98%, 99% of scientists tell us, here's what's happening in the world. And we have a mainstream political movement in this country that says about those things, fuck you, no, it's not. Not just no, it's not, but fuck you. And if you tell me that it is, I have a whole strategy I use to fight back against that, right? To say, you're corrupt, you're da-da-da, et cetera, et cetera. That is it's a sort of weaponized form of ignorance and anti-science and oppositional, defiant disorder almost that is very, very successful at converting people. And it's become part of our political machine. And Trump rode it to power, right? And I don't want to say it's exclusive to the Republican Party because it's not. It's a more general political strain, but it has had a lot of success in our political culture. And what I saw in 2020 was vaccines getting sucked into it. Climate change was already part of it, right? Going back to like the 90s. But vaccines, which previously were not part of this, it was like a fringe issue, became part of this mainstream political anti-reality, anti-science machine that then is very hard to eradicate. It's very hard to, I keep using infectious disease metaphors. How did you feel when you saw that happening? Because it really was very clear how it was getting sucked into that, where now, the counter-reality parts of the media, hey, they're all anti-vax, whereas they used to not take a position on it just 5-6 years ago.
Right. I mean, I will admit that, at the point in COVID where the vaccines first came out, I was, in retrospect, hopelessly naive in the sense that I thought that this was going to be a huge setback for the anti-vaccine movement.
Wow.
Because the vaccines were going to save us, right? Because we were living in this hellscape, and there was this hope.
Here's the answer.
Right. And that's all true, except the opposite thing happened in terms of how people felt about vaccines. I think, some of it is that the messaging was not great and people didn't understand when we said, okay, there are, you get 2 doses, that of course there weren't 10 years of data to know that that 2 doses was going to last for 10 years because COVID had only been around for 8 months. So it wasn't surprising when we needed booster doses. It's not surprising that it's not 100% protective against infection, but it does protect you against hospitalization and death really, really well, just like it did at the beginning of the pandemic. But I think that was all lost. I think that those messages sort of primed people to distrust. And then it turned into, you're right, the routine vaccinations got sucked into the same thing.
The degree to which it's now part of American political culture strikes me as something really new, the anti-vaccine movement, and very dangerous going forward. Actually, I want to dwell on COVID one more time before we get into that, though, because how much was the failure of the messaging a failure of our public health apparatus? I mean, on my show, The G Word, that I did for Netflix, we talked about the response to disease. We interviewed Francis Collins at the NIH. We talked about the incredible advancements in medical technology, but we highlighted again the failures of social technology. We went to places in the South that Alabama, Mississippi, places like that had very high COVID death rates, and it's because they didn't have the infrastructure to simply explain to people, go door to door and say, hey, there's something called the COVID vaccine. In a very caring one-on-one way, I'm going to explain to you, hey, here's how this works. It's really going to be good for you and your kids. Here's a dose. We're going to make sure that you have access to it in a way that actually met people where they were at, rather than broadcasting and saying, go to CVS to get something from Pfizer, which is a different relationship. Like it is the American medical system, of which the government and our public health agencies are a part, has a lot of fucking problems, Adam. Is it not a failure of the system to some degree that allowed this, malignancy to take root?
Yeah, I mean, one of the and I don't disagree that the system has problems, and on every side of that, on the public health side, on the technology side, there are things that of course we could do better. I think that at the time for the COVID vaccine specifically, it caught the whole world unaware, and we were not prepared for that. People didn't know when the vaccine was going to be available, if it was going to work, until we had the studies, and then all of a sudden there had to be this enormous apparatus for getting it out to people and getting messaging out to people, and you're right. It's, it works better if you have people who are already trusted delivering messages and answering people's questions. We saw that with the measles outbreak in 2019. The thing that worked was this sort of for helping parents, make good decisions about vaccines, is something that's almost impossible to scale, which is, there was this group of nurses that went to people's living rooms, and, Orthodox Jewish nurses who would go talk to families, explain things, show them studies. That's great. Like, that works in a small community. How do you scale that to a state or to a country? It's hard, especially because the whole thing with public health is that you have a crisis. People pour money into public health, things get better, and then people take the money away from public health, and things are underfunded, and it's,
And I think that's a fair point, that in, the mid 20th century, people were dying of smallpox and polio and measles in a way that was really frightening. And so these public health measures were something that the public wanted, and that was a present threat. And now we have eradicated or eliminated so many of these diseases. And it's not, the importance of vaccines is not viscerally important to people. But I'll also say, what you were describing with smallpox, where it's, hey, we found some cases and we're going to go door to door and identify people and et cetera. It is that one-on-one, I don't know exactly what the measures were at the time, but that one-on-one attention to people is necessary medically. And look, literally the previous interview I recorded of this podcast was with two ProPublica reporters about how much the health insurance industry screws people, right? And how bad it is for Americans. People do not have a good relationship with almost anyone in the medical community. A lot of people don't. And so, I'm talking to you, and I respect your expertise and your point of view, and I love the NIH, and I have a nuanced enough understanding to know, hey, here are the bright spots of the American medical system that I treasure and respect, and our brave public health workers who are doing as much as they can with too little. And also the part that sucks, right? But I can tell there's a difference between which and which. But there's a lot of people whose experience with the American medical system is simply bad. And they're like, I don't have anyone to talk to. And why not turn to, alternative medicine? Because at least those people listen to me, at least those people treat me nice and flatter me and make me feel better emotionally when the medical system fucks with me and steals my money. It feels like these two things must be connected, right?
You're right. And there are fixes that could be there that we don't do. And I agree with you about the insurance companies. And I think we should have single payer. And I am on board with all of that. When there's a crisis, we have to work with what we have.
100%.
But you're right. I think that if you think a little bit more broadly than I was saying, that we in terms of a country, we don't do ourselves any favors in terms of health by setting up a system that is adversarial for the people we're trying to serve. And I have the same problems talking to my insurance company that everyone else does, and I hate it. In your position, you have that much trouble. You would think that you wouldn't have trouble for the same reason that at least people who work at a restaurant get free food. You work in the industry, you'd think you'd have an easy time, but it's difficult for you as well. Yeah, I mean, for everyone, it's horrible.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about, again, the mainstreaming of anti-vax. I just want to end with your big picture view of, we're seeing vaccination rates drop. What are your fears for what this means for children's health going forward and the health of all of us?
Yeah, I mean, I am really worried about this. And I think we're not at a point where we're seeing the worst that's going to happen yet. If vaccine rates continue to drop, we're going to start to see more vaccine preventable diseases. Obviously, we're already seeing this with measles. So just in the last week, there have been 4 cases of measles in Texas. There have been cases in Georgia, in Rhode Island. These are states that haven't had cases since before COVID. I think Rhode Island hadn't had a case in more than 10 years. And yeah, these are small numbers, sure. But the thing is that if you have a small number of cases, like someone who's not vaccinated goes to another country, comes back with measles, they have measles. Hopefully they'll do okay. But then there's the wall of immunity around them. We don't have that wall of immunity anymore. And as our rates continue to drop, we'll see measles first because it's the most contagious. But like we're seeing more cases of Hib, which was the thing that I hadn't seen in the first 30 years of my career.
Wow.
And, was seen in the generation before mine. We're seeing more cases of lots of vaccine preventable diseases. And the worst part about it is these are real kids. Like at the end of the day, these are preventable sicknesses and preventable deaths. And we should, not that there aren't any limits to public health, but I think the least that we can do for these kids is to provide them protection against the things that we can protect them against. There are all sorts of things that can be dangerous in childhood, right? I start my book about measles, not with measles, but with a story of an accident in my home in which my younger brother, when I was a kid, was in grave danger of dying. Unfortunately, did not. But it's there are these dangers for kids that you can't vaccinate against, that you can't protect against. But there are things that we can, and it seems like we as a society, not just in the US, but more and more globally, that we're choosing not to provide kids with that kind of protection. And that is sad and it's frightening.
What can we do about it? I mean, are there steps that you think we can be taking to reverse this trend?
Yeah, well, so first of all, thank you for having me on, because I like the potential to bring this message to people. I think it's difficult in the current media environment to make sure that voices that are speaking about science and that are promoting things that are good for health, like vaccines, that they're out there. It is. I think pediatricians and scientists in general are not always people who are comfortable getting out there and being political or being, targeting messages to large groups of people. I think we need to get better at that. I think what we're seeing now is, in part a result of one side of this argument being much better at delivering their message than the other side. So
yeah.
I think a lot of that is on us, like, is on my colleagues and the public health folks and pediatricians to get out there more. It is hard. There sadly isn't an easy answer to this. And I don't want it to be a situation where we have to go back to a time when we're seeing more children's deaths for people to realize that, that vaccines are valuable.
Yeah, and it's part of a bigger problem of how do we fight back against this sort of counter-reality strain in American thinking that is it's like a drug-resistant bacteria. It's like everything that we throw at it. I've spent my career trying to dispel misinformation on this very subject, and I've only seen it grow and grow. And it seems to somewhat exceed our ability to dispel the misconceptions. The way that this has grown till again now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. leading the Health of Human Services. What is your fear for his tenure and what you think it might mean for public health?
Yeah, I think it's potentially disastrous. I mean, if you look at his answers during his Senate testimony, just in the last couple of days, he's on the track to get a job where he's in charge of Medicare and Medicaid. He couldn't say basic things about Medicare. He misidentified Medicare Parts A, B, C, and D. And then at the end of that line of questioning said, I got all the answers right. And that's exactly it. That's the Trump plan. That's the Kennedy plan, is just, outright lie, say that you are correct about things. And he, as we were talking about, he not only he doesn't value expertise. He is actively suspicious of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks that all scientists and all pediatricians and everyone is conflicted and that there are multiple answers to anything. It's a very sort of lawyerly way of approaching things. He said many times during his testimony how, well, only a jury can decide what the truth is in terms of, whether vaccines are dangerous or something. And that's not who decides that. There is truth, and you approach truth with science. And and he doesn't value that. And I think he sees himself as his mandate as going in and destroying these institutions. And we're even right now, we're in a point where the CDC isn't able to communicate with the WHO. That is horrible. That is dangerous for Americans in the short term, and very much so in the long term. And I think that if you cripple these agencies, which he may do, you put us in a dangerous position.
Do you have any hope that the people at these agencies, many of whom are science-based practitioners like yourself, if put a guy in charge who actually doesn't know anything about what they do, is there a chance that they're, will be able to hold the line against someone who you have to hope that actual expertise and intelligence and truth is more powerful than lies and ignorance and falsity. In the long run, that is something that I do believe, that the truth is more powerful than a lie. That you are better equipped when you have real information rather than false information. Is it possible that it'll win the day in the end?
I hope so. I'm concerned because I think that this is dangerous. This is different from the first Trump administration in the sense that there really seems to be this move to clear out federal workers, including federal workers with expertise. And I know many people who work at CDC and NIH and FDA, and these are good people. These are smart people. And I'm worried that those folks are going to be cleared out in favor of people who want to promote Kennedy's agenda, or if not Kennedy, whoever ends up in where.
I'm very worried about that as well. And we're just going to have to see how it plays out and continue to try to share the truth as best we can and try to protect each other. I'm really grateful for your work, protecting kids and trying to keep kids safe, and for coming on the show to talk to us about it. The name of the book is Booster Shot. People can pick up a copy at our special bookshop, factuallypod.com/books. Where else can people find your work, Adam?
Great. So adamratnermd.com is where I have, some of the writing events, things like that. That's a good place to look. And the book is available anywhere you find books. And I really, really appreciate your having me on. This was really fun.
So grateful to have you, Adam. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Well, thank you once again to Dr. Adam Ratner for coming on the show. If you want to pick up a copy of his book, you can do so at factuallypod.com/books. And just a reminder that any book you purchase there will support not just this show, but your local bookstore as well. If you'd like to come see me on the road in Chicago, Boston, Burlington, Vermont, London, Amsterdam, Providence, Rhode Island, Vancouver, Eugene, Oklahoma City, or Tulsa, head to adamconover.net for all those tickets. If you want to support the show directly, head to patreon.com/adamconover. $5 a month gets you every episode of the show ad-free. For $15 a month, I will read your name in the credits of every single episode. This week, I want to thank 90 Miles from Needles, Aaron Matthew, Andrew Harding, Alaska, Amy, Thortron. If you want to join them, head to patreon.com/AdamConover. I want to thank my producers, Sam Roudman and Tony Wilson, everybody here at HeadGum for making the show possible. Thank you so much for listening, and we're going to see you next time on Factually.
That was a HeadGum podcast.